we are starting a new chapter, chapter 3. New chapters are always exciting. In chapter 3, we are taking the knowledge that we have of the godly soul, and now we're getting into the details. We are in the section of the first 17 chapters of Tanya. In the first 17 chapters, we have the long way, which means we use our minds to learn about God, to delve and contemplate and immerse ourselves in this knowledge of God, to create an emotional response. The goal of all of Tanya, all 53 chapters, really in essence, all 5 books within the work called Tanya, is to bring a Jew to have an emotional relationship with God. That is the foundation of everything we do in this class. We've been having this class since 1990. If you know God in your mind, that doesn't necessarily translate into someone who serves. If you feel God in your heart, if you love and fear God, automatically, the natural response is you serve God. So the knowledge, well, Tanya is all about knowledge of God. True. Because how do we get to our heart? The mind rules the heart in a godly way. So we immerse our mind with knowledge of God. We think and think into that knowledge to reach our heart, that with the powers of our soul, we create the love and fear of God, which then automatically leads us to a life of serving God, a life of connecting to God, a life of being with God. If you love, you want to give to. We love God, we want to give to him. If you love, you want to be with. You want to be with the person you love. We love God, we want to be with him. And I'm with God in the act of service. As I learn Torah, as I do the commandment, the mitzvah, God and I are one. If I love, I want to be one with God. All I want to do is serve him. It tastes good. It's interesting. One of the Maimarim that were released in honor of the 22nd of Shvat, it's in the 6th volume of the Rebbe's volumes of edited Maimarim, speaks about the idea of this week's Torah portion, right? It's Parshas Mishpatim, and which is the laws. And then it says the first law we speak about is an eved, is a slave. And it's like, that's sort of odd, meaning that's the most common things Jews had were slaves. Not really. And it was only for a certain amount of time. Who has slaves nowadays, right? It only lasted a certain amount of time in very specific conditions with so many laws surrounding slaves. Whoever had a slave anyway? It says anyone who acquired a Jewish slave acquired a master for himself. There's so many laws concerning how you could treat the Jewish slave. It made it really difficult for those masters. Not worth it. So why is God choosing, when he's discussing the mishpatim, the civil laws? So the answer given according to the Hasidic thought is because a slave expresses nullification. So the first law we're discussing is slaves, meaning expressing the idea of our nullification to God, okay? So the Rebbe says, well, if the whole reason we're bringing out the concept of slave is to express nullification, why do we start with a Jewish slave? Meaning we have a Jewish slave that serves for 6 years and then is freed. We have a Jewish slave who says, no, I love my master. This is such a good life. I'm saying Jewish slaves had a very good life in a certain sense. I want to stay as long as I can. I'm going to stay until the Jubilee year. Okay. But either option of the Jewish slave, even the one that stayed until the Jubilee, eventually by the Jubilee, get out. You got to get out. Who is perpetually a slave? The non-Jewish slave. So if we want to express nullification to God, why don't we discuss the non-Jewish slave? I mean, it's also a law. It's also a civil, rational law. Let's talk about the laws of the non-Jewish slave. We also have laws concerning how we can treat them. We also have to treat them properly. So why isn't that the first law? So the Lavav Rebbe says because a non-Jewish slave represents a typical slave. And it says a slave serves because he has no choice. He'd rather be free. He'd rather be hefker, free from the yoke and the burden of his master. But he's a slave. That is a certain type of service of God. God, you're the boss. You've got all the cards. You've got all the power. You've got the limitless credit card of what I want. So I have to serve you because I'm scared what would happen if I didn't, because I want what you're going to give me, whatever the motivation. I have to serve. Jewish slaves represents serving with a geschmack, with a joy, with a pleasure, with a delight. There was a pleasure element in the service. That's the type of slave God wants the Jew to be. Nullified to God with pleasure, with a joy in serving God. It's a burden of service of God that feels so light because we love what we're doing. That's the goal of Tanya. We want to learn about God, immerse our mind in the reality of God, to bring that awareness to our heart, that our soul, through this immersion in godly thought, will create in the heart love and fear. And with that love and fear, we will serve with joy, with pleasure, and completely. So that's overarching what we're doing. And specifically, chapters 1 through 17 is really focusing on the fill your mind to awaken and creating your heart. Within that, chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5, those 4 chapters are really focusing on the godly souls version of the story. Starting in chapter 6, we go to the animal souls version of the story, so to speak. In chapter 2, we focused on what is a godly soul in an overarching way. The godly soul as this piece of God, this incredibly high piece to such a degree, as we did last class, that this world in no way rules it. And that's why we said, what? It says in the Zohar that parents determine the sanctity of the soul. Impossible. Totally negates our chapter. And the Alter said, right, yeah, that's not talking about the soul. That's talking about the garments, the skin of the soul. The soul is beyond anything in this world. The soul is a piece of God. As the Rebbe Rashab, the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe says, the core of the soul is from the core of God himself. So after chapter 2, we have a tremendous appreciation, hopefully. Hopefully we translate it into the vernacular, meaning who we are. We have a tremendous appreciation for who we are as this tremendous beacon of light. Every single one of us is a beacon of God light, a beacon, not, oh, those people or that person or every single Jew is an enormous beacon of God light. Now that we got that straight and we can look ourselves in the mirror and expect to see a beacon of light, now we're going into the details. Chapter 3 discusses the chinos, the attributes, the powers within the soul. Chapter 4 is the garments of the soul. And chapter 5 is Torah, the soul immersed in Torah and what happens at that point. Now, why are we so much wanting to understand our soul? As we said, Tanya is having a relationship with God, loving God, fearing God, so I will perfectly serve God. Meaning Tanya is not theology. We are not trying to become professors here, or lecturers, theorists. We're Jews that are workers. Oivdim, we're workers serving God. That's our goal, to be a Jew who serves God. So why do I need to know all these details about my godly soul? There's a verse that says, Mibsari echazeh Eloka. From my flesh, I will perceive, I will see God. Meaning we are made in God's image. My soul is like a mirror in miniature of God's structure. So the more I understand the workings of my soul, the more I can extrapolate or I naturally sense how God works from the understandings of the working of my own soul. And that's why we are going now in detail in chapter 3 and chapter 4 to really understand the technicality, so to speak, of what's going on inside my soul. Looking inside chapter 3, V'hine, behold, kol b'china madrega mishalosh elu, every aspect, every level from these 3, nefesh, ruach, and neshama. Now, as I've already taught, the soul has 5 levels. Nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, yichida. Right here in this chapter, I just listed 3 of the 5. Now, really, what I'm saying is true for all 5. But we focus in Tanya primarily on nefesh, ruach, and neshama because the nefesh, ruach, and neshama are found within the body. Each one of us is impacted in a very inner way by these 3 base level of soul because they're within me. We all possess a chaya, we all possess a yichida, the 2 higher levels that are, for most of us, most of the time, outside our body, which doesn't mean they're not impacting us. They are impacting us, but in a more peripheral way because they're not inside of us. Literally inside, the nefesh is found in the liver, the ruach in the right side of the heart, the neshama in the brain. That's why the nefesh in the liver is the action orientation mode of the soul, the fulfillment of the practical action of the commandments is expressing the nefesh. The ruach is the speech and emotions of the soul. That's why the ruach is in the right side of the heart, the place of godly emotion. The neshama is in the brain because the neshama is the intellect of the soul. When you are studying God's words, or when you are thinking God thoughts, or when you are planning to do godly actions, all those brain processes, the neshama orientation of the soul, the third level of these five, neshama is what's dominant. And you can say, wait, isn't the neshama mean soul? Yes. Overarching the entire five-tiered structure is called neshama, soul. It's also actually called nefesh, nefesh Eloki, godly soul. But within that structure, which you could call neshama, you could call nefesh Eloki, has within it five levels. Nefesh, action in the liver, ruach, emotion, speech in the right side of the heart, neshama, thought in the brain. And then we have two higher levels, chaya and yechida. Chaya and yechida are both generally external to the body, meaning they're too lofty to be within a physical body. We're told that very holy people, what we would generally call tzaddikim, very holy Jews, their chaya does enter into their body. And the yechida is even more intense than the chaya. And that, we're told, comes in certain times of tremendous spiritual energy. For example, coming up this coming week, Rosh Chodesh. We actually have 2 days of Rosh Chodesh this coming week. And for that entire 48-hour duration, the Yechida will be inside our body. The end of Yom Kippur, that highest prayer, the Ne'ilah moment, the Yechida is within. If a Jew is sacrificing for God, there's a moment of self-sacrifice. The Yechida is within our body. That's the highest level. Now, it's still a level. It's not the core. Very often, the way we describe Yechida, it sounds like the core of the soul, but the core of the soul is nameless. Yechida is the highest of the five levels of soul. So therefore, the Rebbe now is saying nefesh, ruach, neshama, not saying chaya and yechida, though, this is what I'll say, chaya and yechida also possess these same 10 powers that we're going to attribute now to the nefesh, ruach, and neshama. So there's 10 powers on each level. There are 5 levels, so there are 50 powers that we're talking here primarily, nefesh, ruach, neshama. So continuing, nefesh, ruach, neshama, klula, which are comprised Me'eser bechinos, of 10 powers, 10 aspects, keneged eser spheres ayonos neshtalshel mehen, which are parallel to the 10 holy spheros that they are derived from. God, who is of course beyond any description and any definition and any boxes, chooses at a certain point in the creation to put his energy into boxes. That starts really with what we call the world of tohu, meaning we have God prior to any constriction, and then that energy of God on a certain level, a certain aspect of it becomes constricted enough, like squeezed in enough, so there's a little space where the God energy is less intense, and in that space, creation will form. There's something Kabbalistically called a kav, called a halal, many Kabbalistic terms we could throw out, but basically it's just constricting and constricting and constricting and constricting that God energy until we have the beginning of what's called world. Again, nothing here is physical. There's all spiritual energies. In the beginning of the worlds, that first concept of a world, we say, well, there's 10 spheres in one. And then we have more constriction and we get the first real world of 10 divine energies. And that's what we call the world of Tohu, which by deliberate design, the lights of those energies were too powerful for the vessels containing those lights, and they shattered, the lights ascended, the vessels fell down into the next reality, which is our reality, the worlds of tikkun, of rectifying, of picking up those shards that fell from this higher domain, the vessels of the world of tohu. In the worlds of tikkun, we have 4 spiritual realities, Atzilus, Bria, Yitzira, Asiya, the world of being, the world of creation, the world of formation, the world of descent. And then we have our physical reality, meaning not just planet Earth, but the entire Milky Way galaxy, which is the physical dimension of the spiritual Asiya, the spiritual world of descent, the physical manifestation of that world of descent. In all of these realities, we have God's energy, a certain part of God's energy, of course, not the totality, but God's lights coming in 10 different channels. Those 10 channels are called spheros, like from the word sapphire, which is like a precious, shining, luminous stone, right? Or from the idea of mispar, like a number, because we're taking limitless God energy and making it constricted enough that we can say, we can call it by a name. We can have a number. We have 10 of them, and they have names and they have characteristics. So we took limitless energy and made it so limited, it can be part of a mispar, a number. So on one hand, sphera represents the enormity of the light, like sapphire, this luminous, precious stone. And conversely and complementarily, it's a mispar. It's something that's become limited. And we have these 10 dimensions of God energy and all of the spiritual realities. Silus and Bria, Yetzirah and Asiya, being, creation, formation, descent. And in the soul of a Jew, because our soul is an image of God, we also have these 10 powers. By us, they're called bechinos, aspect. It's not a sapphire. It's not this shining, precious stone. It's a more muted energy, but it's the same 10. Our 10 are bechinos, and God's 10, the spheros, are literally parallel images, meaning same number, 10 and 10. The same names by God. Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yisod, Malchus. By my soul. Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yisod, Malchus. Same names. So we got the same number, we got the same names. It's in the same order. By God, it's Chachma, and then Bina, and then Das, and then Chesed. By me, it's also Chachma, and then Bina, and then Das. So the same number, the same names, the same order. By God's energies and by mine, the intellect gives birth to the emotions. What that means precisely, we'll discuss at length soon in this chapter. But there's the same relationship between intellect and emotions by God's spheros and by my bechinos. By God's spheros and by my bechinos, both have the quality called hiskalalos. Hiskalalos means inclusion. What inclusion means is that the energies blend. For those of you that you can remember to last year or many, many years of counting Sfiras HaOmer, what we count from the second night of Passover up until the holiday of Shavuos, we count 49 days. And in the counting, we each night reference the emotive attribute of God that this night is parallel to God's emotive energy and the emotive energy of my soul, right? Because we are really through these 49 days accessing God's energy, we're really refining those energies in my soul. And there are 3 intellectual powers in my soul and 7 emotion. There are 3 intellectual spheres by God and 7 emotion, but we count for 49 days. So how does that work? Because there's his kalos, because they blend. So the 7 emotions each subdivide into the 7 emotions. 7 times 7 is 49. So that's how we count for 49 days, each day refining another aspect of the emotional attributes of my animal soul, godly soul, pulling on the energy of God of that trait. This idea of his kalalos began with the worlds of tikkun, meaning, I said prior to tikkun, there was a spiritual reality called tohu, which means like chaos, where you had 10 very powerful lights in vessels too thin, and they shattered, as we discussed, and the lights ascended, and the shards fell into our reality. But it wasn't only that the lights were too powerful for the vessels. Another factor was there was no hiskalos. There was no concept of the blending of the lights. And because there was no blending, they were weaker, the vessels, and they couldn't contain the lights. When there's a blending, there's also a shared strength, and that protects the lights to stay in the vessels. And that began with the world of Tikkun, again, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, being, creation, formation, and descent. So they all blend. So you can have, by God, Chesed Shebegvura, or Gvur Shebechesed, and we have in our soul, Chesed Shebegvura and Gvur Shebechesed, right? We don't have 7 powers of emotion on each of these 5 levels. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yichida, we have 49, because they're all blending in each other. So again, same number of powers, same names of powers, same order of powers. In all of them, the emotions are product of the intellect, and in all of them, by God and by us, there's this ability to blend. And the 6th point of this parallelism between our soul powers and God's energies is that in both, there's a higher domain beyond the 10. By God, there's Or Ein Sof, the limitless life of God that did not get into those containers and vessels. In each world, there's the Kesser element. The Kesser means the crown. Over the 10, if you would envision the 10 as like the structure of a body and the 3 intellect are like the brain, well, then there's a crown on top of the head. They're powers higher than the 10. Kesser, the crown, has 2 powers, will, and even deeper than will, pleasure, called Kabbalistically Arich and Atik. Those are higher than the 10. And they give an energy more limitless than the more limited, muted energies within the 10 vessels, the spheros. Not that they're muted energies, but relatively speaking. And by ourselves as well. This is another parallelism, that just as I have those 10 powers, I also have to have a force higher. And I do, because deeper than the 10 powers, there's this limitless energy to God that's not part of the 10. There's that core of the Jew soul that's deeper than any of these, or finite, so to speak, powers. We sometimes call the Pintalayid, that spark of God within the soul of the Jew, that piece that literally we are, a piece of God, literally, that piece is beyond those 10 limited powers. And in that core God energy is found the core powers of the soul of a Jew: limitless belief in God, our limitless self-sacrifice for God, our limitless love and fear of God. All of these core Jewish powers. Self-sacrifice means nullification. Nullification is higher than reason. So within my 10, I've got my emotions, I've got my intellect. Well, neither of that's self-sacrifice, because self-sacrifice is higher than intellect. So that's from that core higher than powers. Just as we have it by God, that limitless light, the lights in Kesser, so too we have in our soul, in the core, these higher, limitless, relatively speaking, energies that give the Jew the basic core reality as a Jew, no matter what. So that's the first point we're developing in this chapter. We have these 5 levels of soul, or as we're saying in chapter 3, plus the 2 I mentioned that are out of body. Within each level, we have these 10 bechinos, and these 10 bechinos, as I've just discussed, are parallel to God's sphere energies. Any questions, any thoughts on any of this? So these 10 powers subdivide into 2 groups. They're split into 2 levels. Shehen shalosh imos, the 3 mothers, v'sheva kfulos, and the 7 pairs. What do you mean the 3 mothers and the 7 pairs? Well, what the Rebbe is saying decoded is, just like by God, as I just explained, God has 10 powers on every world. We have 10 powers on every level of soul. God's 10 powers divide into intellect and emotion. My 10 powers divide into intellect and emotion. By God, he's got 3 intellect and 7 emotion. By me, I have 3 intellect and 7 emotion. By God, his intellect is Chacham Bina Das. By me, my intellect is Chacham Bina Das, right? So we're saying here, the 2 groupings are intellect and emotion. But the Rebbe doesn't use the term intellect and emotion, though that's what he's talking about. The Rebbe gives a synonym. The Rebbe calls the intellect mothers and the emotion pairs. So why are we saying mothers and pairs instead of intellect and emotion? So when we say mothers, we're really expressing a very key factor in the soul power of intellect. Really 2 ways we can understand this idea of mothers. The most foundational understanding is that the mother gives birth to the child. That's a mother. You're only a mother if you have a child. To be a woman, we can't be a mother. To be the mother, you have birthed a child. The key function of the intellect is to be a mother, is to give birth to the emotions. As I explained when we first started this chapter, the emotions are products of the intellect on the godly soul. The animal soul, the emotions, we're born with them. We didn't need to work to develop anger or jealousy or pride or stress or low self-esteem. No, those just come natural. But on the godly soul, love of God, love of Torah, love of the Jew, any of the godly emotions, as I said, we use our mind, fill it with an understanding of God. We're using the 3 faculties of intellect, of the soul. And then from there, we create the godly emotion. So the Rebbe is not saying intellect. He doesn't call them the 3 powers of seichel, of intellect. He's calling them mothers to express their key functionality. You could think of other reasons why intellect has significance in a godly soul. Of course, there are other reasons. But the core reason is to be a mother, to produce the motion. Why is that the core issue of the intellect? Because we want to be servants of God. We want to be committed to giving to God. And what's motivating me, the drive to give, the drive to serve, is my emotion. So that the intellect produces the emotion. Wow, that's like the most amazing, important, significant aspect. Also, you could say the woman, the mother, the woman, in the Torah perspective, has a title, Akeres Habayis, the mainstay of the house. Akeres is from the word ikar, the main principal element of a home is the woman. So by calling the intellect mothers, there's also the implication, this is the ikar. This is a foundation of the godly soul, is its intellect capacity. So again, decoded, we just read that these 10 powers are divided into 2, right? The 3 mothers, meaning the 3 powers of intellect. I would just explain why intellect we call mothers. And the 7 kfulos, pairs. There are many, many different explanations I've seen on why the emotions are called pairs. Many. One is that when we look at the emotions, they always really have a pair. They all have a partner, not in the 7, but when the 7 are really expressed in any level of soul, there's really 70, right? Because as I said, every trait of these 10 attributes subdivide into every other trait. When we count Sfiras HaOmer, we have 49 because it's 7 emotions subdivided into 7 emotions. We're only talking about pure emotion is what we're refining in the animal soul, in the godly soul during those 49 days. But really, all of the 10 powers subdivide into all of the 10 powers. So there's 7 emotions subdivided into the 10 powers. 7 times 10 is 70. So at every level of soul, there are 70 emotional traits. So those 70 split into 35 pairs because every emotion has its partner. And then the Rebbe keeps going because that's not the only name he gives for emotions. He also gives another name. So the Rebbe, to explain this, says, Kfulos, Peirush, meaning to say, the mothers, the 3 powers that are the mothers, in other words, the intellect, Peirush, Chachma, Bina, V'das. Well, I mean the 3 powers of intellect, Chachma, Bina, and Das. Those 3 terms I'm not going to explain now because the entire chapter 3 is devoted, really, starting with the next page, to explaining those terms. So we will learn a lot about those terms. V'shivas Yemei HaBinyan. And now I'm not telling you what they are yet. I'm giving you another name for them, right? First, I have pairs, which I already decoded for you as the emotions. And now, instead of doing like I did for the intellect and listing the emotions, I first throw in a name for the emotions. Besides calling them pairs, I call them the 7 days of building. And then I'll tell you what they are. Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Chulei. I mean the emotional traits. Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, etc. Now, in this chapter, the Rebbe is focusing on explaining Chachma, Bina, and Das, the 3 intellectual powers. He does not explain here, it is explained in other places in Tanya and other places in Chassidus at length, the emotion. So I will now take some time to explain the emotions. Before doing so, I want to focus on this other name for the emotion. So again, we have intellect. The name for intellect is the mothers. We gave 2 reasons why mothers. And then we had the emotions, 7 emotions, which we gave a synonym for. Pairs, I gave you 1 reason from quite a number, all pretty similar or different nuances of thought on why the emotions are called pairs. And now we got another name for the emotions, and they're called the 7 days of building. Why are they called the 7 days of building? They're called the 7 days of building because God created the world with emotion. There were 7 days of creation. We don't usually call them 7 days of building. We call them Shivas Yemei Bereshis, the 7 days of creation. Those are those 7 days of building. 7 days of building, creation. So the 7 days of building, 7 days of creation. And what does that have to do with emotions? Because every day of those 7 days, another emotion was dominant as the building power of that day, meaning nothing is random. God has 7 emotions, and therefore there were 7 days of building, the 7 days of creation, because every day of creation was a dominancy of another emotion. And each of those 7 days created 1,000 years of history. As it says in Tehillim and Psalms, that a day for God is like 1,000 years. So the 7 days, 7,000 years, meaning all the way in the beginning, right? The world is now 5,786 years, going strong. But 5,786 years ago, we had creation. And creation gave the world a mandate of 7,000 years. What happens after 7,000 years? We morph into a different existence. Exactly what will be, none of us know and none of us talk about. So I don't know. Meaning, will the world cease and all will just stop existing? You say, well, got a long time until we get to that, so we don't need to really wonder about it now. No, it is not the end. It's opening up a gate to a newer, higher beginning. But what's past that gate, I don't know. So we don't talk about it. We don't know about it beyond our human fathoming mind at this point. But something past the year 7,000. But the world as we know it, as this type of world, has a mandate of 7,000 years because we have 7 days of creation and every day created 1,000 years of history. So I'm going to go through it briefly. And as I'm going through it, one of my goals in going through it is to give a better understanding of the emotional traits. Because again, as we continue in the chapter, we're going to focus on the intellect, Chacham, Bin, and Das, and we're going to speak about them at length, but we don't come back to really explaining the emotions. And I think it's good to understand it because throughout Tanya, we're going to reference them. So it's good to know what we're talking about. So the first day of history, day one of creation, is the first emotion, chesed. Now, let me also preface before I say, there's so much I could say about all of these emotions. There's so much in Hasidic thought about all of these emotions. Well, I can't just pour everything out, right? But just be like, what? So I'm just going to say a few ideas, but please know far more than I'm saying is what I'm not saying. And if you have any questions, please ask because I might be able to answer you based on other information that I'm not sharing now just because I have to filter out and just try to focus on a few ideas. So chesed is the first emotion. It's the most foundational emotion. It's emotion. Literally, chesed means kindness. It's love, loving kindness. It's an emotion. Kindness is the expression of that emotion. But it's the love. That's the core that expresses itself in beneficence and kindness and giving. And chesed is an intensely powerful emotion, meaning we have 7 emotions. The first 3, sometimes they're drawn as like 2 triangles. Okay, if I have at a whiteboard, which of course I could have with Zoom, but whatever, never bothered trying to figure out the technology of how to do it. That's probably simple. You have a triangle, right side chesed, left side gevura, point of the triangle. I'm not saying the base, but if you might view it as a base, it's going like that. The point of the triangle, where both of those 2 sides funnel into, is tiferes. Chesed, gevura, tiferes, a triangle. Those are the primary emotions. And then there's another triangle. Chesed, gevura, tiferes, netzach, on the same line as chesed, hoid, on the same line as gevura, yisoid. Again, right side of the triangle, netzach, left side, hoid, and what both of those lines or arrows really raise are pointing into yisoid. Netzach, hoid, yisoid, a minor image of chesed, gevura, tiferes. So we have chesed and netzach on the right side, gevura and hoid on the left, tiferes and yisoid in the middle. All the things are very, very significant that we might or not get to talking about them. And then under those 2 triangles, we have malchus, sovereignty, which is quasi-emotion, not really. It's more a state of being. So let's get back to chesed. So chesed is the most foundational trait. The most foundational trait is love. Foundation of everything is love. It is the foundational trait of love. It's the first triangle, which means it's very intense. So this isn't like, the normative love you feel for someone that you love in your life. It's like if there was a crisis and your love is pouring out. That's the type of love we're talking about here. So incredibly intense love, which expresses itself in incredibly intense giving. That's chesed. And that created the first day of creation, which created the first millennium of history. So the first day of creation, what was created on the first day? Well, actually, the Midrash says everything was created on the first day. The entire 7 days of creation, what was unfolding and put into place over the next 6 days, all was created on the first day, but it was in a sort of chaotic state. And then on day 2, we did this with those things. And on day 3, we did that with those things. And on day 4, we're like sorting through, like unpacking, so to speak, organizing everything that got dumped, created on that first day. And that created a millennium of history. The millennium of history meaning 1,000 years of God's chesed. Intense, passionate, extreme loving kindness, which, as we're saying, was expressed in the first day of creation as everything, but in almost a jumbled space because we couldn't handle everything. Or something else we saw in the first day of creation that expressed this intense, too intense almost for us, loving kindness was the sun. Now, if you know the 7 days of creation, you'll say, no, the sun was created on the fourth day. That's true. But there was a sun that was created on the first day. Right? Erev v'hi boker, right? There was a night and there was a day. So there was a sun going on there 3 days before the sun was created. What was that sun? That was the sun of the 7 days of creation. So we got a sun on day 1. We got a sun on day 4. Yes. Because on day 1 was the sun of the 7 days of creation. But that was not the sun we experience now because it was way too intense and way too powerful. And after the 7 days of creation, it was carefully wrapped away and will be expressed and exposed, and the world will handle it by Mashiach, by the redemption. But for the past 5,786 years, minus 1 week, we never experienced that sun. So light, giving, I mean, the sun is the light, is the energy, is the fuel of planet Earth, but too intense for us to handle. That was chesed, this intense love, this intense giving, expressed in the first day of creation by this sun, too powerful in essence for the world, by everything being created. We got everything but jumbled chaos because more than we had the vehicles, the vessels to handle it. And that was the first millennium of history. Because in the first millennium of history, if we look in scriptures, in Genesis and Bereshit, we see, wow, people lived for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, right? Adam, the first man, was supposed to live for 1,000 years. He donated some of his years to King David. So he only lived into the 900s. The oldest people lived into the 900s. So maybe more regular was in the 800s, 800 plus years of life. Like, what does that mean? What we think nowadays, if someone is 101 or 102, we're like, wow, look at that longevity. Baby, a youngster. What life was in the first millennium, hundreds of years. And everyone had perfect health. There was no sickness. So they're living for hundreds of years with youth, with strength, with no illness, right? It says they sneezed and they died. That was their one warning. Sneeze, gone. Such blessings, like that intense chesed, intense giving. But you'd think they'd be the holiest people ever. And we know they weren't. Because sometimes it's like giving, giving, giving. We don't have the vessels. We don't have the capacity to contain this in a beneficial fashion. So we're being given, but we don't know what to do with it. So it was a millennium where the high majority of the population didn't serve God at all. They got it all. They got the years, they got the health, but it was almost like the sages call bread of shame, what we might call nowadays a welfare state. Being given, being given, being given without anything coming back in return. And it became sour. It went bad. It wasn't good. That was the first millennium. Enormous giving, too much, so much that we didn't have the capacity to utilize properly, and leading to the next millennium, which is the next day of creation. And I see we are exactly at our stopping point. So we will stop here to be continued next week. We will go more quickly through the rest of creation, understanding the divine trait, the day of creation, and the millennium that day created. Does he pick a law that seemingly is so not commonly relevant?